1917 to 1918, about 367,000 black soldiers served in the armed forces, 100,000 of them in France. 1941 to 1945, more than 1 million black soldiers served in World War II. 1948, President Truman issued an executive order initiating the integration of the armed forces. 1950 to 1953, outbreak of war in Korea accelerated integration in all services. 1964 to 1973, of 274,937 African Americans who served during the Vietnam War, 5,681 died in combat. 1991, about 104 black soldiers served in the Persian Gulf War, accounting for 20% of all American soldiers there, compared with 8.7% in World War II and 9.8% in the Vietnam War. Awarding of the Medal of Honors. Black soldiers account for only 2.5% of the 3,427 medals of honor awarded. There may have been a few since the statistics came out. In the Spanish-American War, the total number of Congressional Medal of Honors was 109, African Americans 6. World War I, the total medals was 124, African Americans received 1. World War II, total medals was 440, African Americans received 7. Korean War, 131, African Americans received 2. Vietnam, the total medals 239, African Americans 20. The first person I want to talk about is my uncle. His name was Uriel Octavius Ray. My brother, many of you may remember my brother Uriel, and my sister's son has the middle name of Uriel. But this is Uncle Uriel, who served in World War I. This is a picture of him when he was in France, and actually the picture was taken. While there, he wrote a diary. Now keep in mind, not very much schooling was available to them, but they took advantage of everything that they could. He, along with his brother, Will Owens, were in the same unit, was sent to France in 1918. I do not know the battles that he was involved in, but he wrote a diary while traveling in France, a copy of which is included on that poster. In the diary, he describes the beautiful buildings and talk about the churches which had the Black Madonna, which I guess in essence probably blew his mind, because the building that burned in France recently, the Black Madonna was housed in that building. He was fascinated because he mentions the Black Madonna twice in his diary. He talks about the race problem in America. Near the end of his diary, he states, and I guess this runs in the family, I don't keep silent long enough and try to hold my jaw, but I want to say a word right here and now about the Jim Crow law. They say that color strikes a line and say just what they might. But I want to tell you right here and now that the Jim Crow law ain't right. There are registration cards on that poster, and 3 of my uncles and cousins, also the registration cards on that poster. We went to visit Uncle Uriel. He lived in Houston, and he would come to Kansas City and visit us. On his last visit here, he worked for the Folger's Coffee Company, Folger's Coffee Company. And we visited the company, Folger's Coffee Company, which was located on the corner of 6th and Broadway. We were given a tour of the building, a grand tour of the plant's operation. He was highly respected within the Folders Coffee Company. The next person I want to talk about is John Henry Johnson. Probably the best book that I've found, complete book, is The American Negro in World War I. I have a pretty extensive library, but this is one of the books that I treasure. Reading the book is utterly amazing with the pictures. They talk about John Henry Johnson, and I have a poster here on him. This book was left in the house I purchased from Bishop Gray. It was written by Emmett Scott and copyrighted in 1919. Mrs. Scott has served as Secretary of Tuskegee Institute and was Booker T. Washington's private secretary for 17 years. He was appointed as a special advisor with respect to the colored people of the U.S. colored drafted men and colored men who constitute units of the National Guard Division, a complete and authentic narration from official sources of the participation of the American soldiers of the Negro race in the World War for Democracy. This book is utterly amazing. It has pictures and pictures of battles and really chronicles a lot of the battles and what actually happened. I would imagine this book is very difficult to find, but if you can, try and make it a part of your library. This book has pictures of soldiers in battle, description of battles, a complete compilation of history of the African American in World War I. Johnson was a hero of the African American community, probably the one that was most widely known at the end of the war. Talking to a person here tonight, Mr. Stow was talking to Brother Rice and Miss Felicia, a relative. There are a lot of stories, but John Henry Johnson was really known across the country. I'm reading a letter that Colonel Haywood wrote to the wife of Private Johnson right after he performed his act of heroism. And it states, "There is no prouder chapter in the history of the Negro race than the records of the American and French armies that tells the heroic exploits of colored soldiers, exploits that rank with the most glorious example of individual courage and devotion to duty in all history. The names of those men who through their personal bravery and daring won the coveted Distinguished Service Cross of the American Army and the Cross of War from France. The first American soldiers of any race, white or black, to receive the French Cross of War was Henry Johnson of Albany, New York, and Needham Roberts of Trenton, New Jersey. Both men were privates in the 369th Infantry, the old 15th New York National Guard Regiment, also known as Hells Angels. This regiment was visited with French troops, and early in May 1918, with other American Negro detachments, were put in charge of a long section of the front line with trenches. The event that gave to Johnson Roberts the honor of being the first Americans to win the French War Cross. We had learned some time ago from captured German prisoners that Germans had heard of the regiment of black Americans in this section, and the German officers had been told that their men, and they told their men how easy to combat and capture them it would be. So this raiding party came over, and on the contrary, Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts attended very strictly to their duties. At the beginning of the attack, Germans fired a volley of bullets and grenades, and both of the boys were wounded. Johnson 3 times and Roberts twice. Then the Germans rushed the post, expecting to make an easy capture. In spite of their wounds, these two boys waited coolly and courageously, and when the Germans were within striking distance, opened fire. Johnson with his rifle and Private Roberts with his helpless position on the ground with hand grenades. But the German raiding party came on in spite of their wounded. And in a few seconds, our boys were at grips with the terrible foe in a desperate hand-to-hand encounter in which the enemy outnumbered them 10-1. The boys inflicted great loss on the enemy, but Roberts was overpowered and about to be carried away when Johnson, who had used all of his cartridges in the magazine of his rifle and had knocked one German down with the butt end of it, drew his bolo knife from his belt. A bolo was a short, heavy weapon carried by the American soldier, with the edge of a razor, the weight of a cleaver, and the point of a butcher knife. He rushed to the rescue of his former comrade and, fighting desperately, opened with his bolo the head of the German who was throttling Roberts, and turned to the Boche who had Roberts by the feet, plunging the bolo into the German bowels. This one was the leader of the German party, and on receiving what must have been the mortal wound, exclaimed in American English without a trace or accent, "Oh, that some of us got me." Thus proving that he was undoubtedly one of the so-called German Americans who came to our country, not to become a good citizen, but to partake of its plenty and bounty, and return to fight for the Kaiser and help enslave the world. He was doubtlessly selected as the leader of the party to speak English, and perhaps followed my soldiers, calling them in English, not to fire, that it was a friend. Henry laid about him right and left with his heavy knife, and Roberts, released from the grasp of the scoundrels, began again to throw hand grenades and exploded them in the midst, and the Germans, doubtless thinking it was the host instead of two brave colored boys fighting like tigers at bay, picked up the dead and wounded. Johnson killed 3 soldiers and hand-to-hand wounded about 25 single-handedly. Many of you may remember the efforts of Herman Johnson, who lived in Kansas City, Missouri, a resident of Kansas City, Missouri, to have the Congressional Medal of Honor conferred on who he thought was his father. This effort lasted for decades before President Obama awarded the Medal of Honor in 2015. I'm going to read an article that appeared in the Kansas City Star in 2015. You know, I don't know if y'all remember when this was going on, and Herman was really focusing, trying to get this done. We felt that when Colin Powell was chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and they have to sign off on it, and that had been held up twice. And we were sure that Colin Powell would sign off on it, but he refused to do it. And it wasn't until 2015 President Obama awarded him the medal. But this is what President Obama stated. Henry Johnson was born in North Carolina in 1892, moved to New York as a teenager and worked as a chauffeur, a coal yard laborer, and a railroad station porter in Albany, New York. He enlisted in the Army in June 1917 and was assigned to the 15th New York Colored Infantry Regiment, an all-black National Guard unit that later would become the 369th Infantry Regiment, sometimes called the Harlem Hellfighters. Newspapers soon told of the Battle of Henry Johnson, but as President Obama detailed Wednesday, Henry Johnson received no recognition from the U.S. Army. When the Army discharged him as a sergeant in 1919, he returned home as a hero. The picture they're riding in an open car down Fifth Street. He was the only person in that parade was an open car, riding down as a hero. But he was unable to return to his pre-war position because of the severity of his injuries. But his own nation didn't award him anything, not even the Purple Heart. Though he had been wounded 21 times, nothing was bravery. Though he had saved a fellow soldier at great risk to himself, Henry left him crippled. He couldn't find work, and his marriage fell apart. Efforts to honor Henry Johnson began in the 1970s, office officials in Albany renamed a boulevard in his honor and later unveiled a bust of this soldier at a park. In 1996, Herman Johnson posthumously received a Purple Heart for his champion continued their research of his wartime service, and many politicians joined the effort. When historians found Henry Johnson's grave in Arlington National Cemetery in 2002, Herman Johnson traveled from Kansas City to Washington and stood alongside the New York Governor George Pataki for a graveside ceremony. It's kind of a tragic story. Herman, and some of you may have known Herman, he was very active, was state representative in Missouri at NAACP, and quite a business person. What they found out is that Henry Johnson was not Herman Johnson's father. He grew up all of his life and thinking that was his father. His mother never told him that was not his father, but they did DNA. But he accepted it, but he was deceased when his father received the Congressional Medal of Honor. But his family felt that they were sure he would be satisfied. At the beginning of the war, all the units were totally segregated and very few black officers. This book described the detail and problem that occurred. Black draftees had to be trained and sent to camps. So strongly did some of the southern states feel about having black troops trained in their state that the officials and citizens visited Washington to protest against such troops being sent to their state for training. This was notably true of South Carolina, a visit being made by Governor Manning, who most strongly conveyed to the War Department the feelings of the citizens of that Commonwealth. With the large number of persons being drafted, there was a need to establish camps for the training of officers. 14 were instituted for the training of white officers, none for colored officers.